During the 1930s, the Japanese Navy did everything it could to dodge restrictions on aircraft carriers. The most famous of these was definitely Ryujo, a ship very deliberately designed to abuse a loophole on what counts as an aircraft carrier, which ended up in a ship of questionable stability and a closed loophole. The other way they tried to get around treaties was designing ships with conversion in mind. The Japanese would build seaplane tenders or other auxiliaries with the full intention of turning them into carriers. By building these ships around a planned conversion, they could be taken in and quickly converted when necessary. Today's video will look at one of those ships, the submarine tender Taigei, better known as the aircraft carrier Ryuho, for a certain value of better known. Even by the standards of Japanese-like carriers, this ship is pretty often ignored. Let's change that in this video. Ryuho's story began, as mentioned, with the submarine tender Taigei. This ship was laid down on April 12, 1933, and launched on November 16th of the same year. This was a very fast turnaround by the standards of any navy. Part of this was due to the ship being welded instead of traditionally riveted, which was still a very new thing for the Japanese Navy, and it showed with poor Taigei, which was, in fact, the first Japanese warship to be all welded. This did, admittedly, lead to a lighter displacement, and a faster construction period. However, because it was such a new process, it also led to problems with hull strength. But before we can talk about that, let's look at Taigei's design. I'll cover the initial design here and talk about the conversion when we reach that point. So, what did that original design actually look like? Taigei displaced around 10,500 tons as built. To their credit, the Japanese did manage to keep the displacement down with their welding, for better or worse. On that displacement, Taigei carried four 12.7 centimeter or 5-inch guns and two twin mounts, one on the bow and one on the stern. These were supported by 12 13.2 millimeter machine guns. Those weapons, both the cannon and machine guns, were purely for self-defense. Taigei was a tender, not a combat warship, something also reflected by a lack of meaningful armor protection. In any case, if the ship had to use her main battery, something had gone seriously wrong, especially with the 3 floatplanes carried aboard for scouting duty, to keep an eye out for any threats to the tender. Not that the ship could really run from any hypothetical threat. Taigei's maximum speed came out to 14 knots, on 14,000 horsepower through 2 shafts. This was not a speedy ship by any stretch of the imagination, although she was somewhat special in using diesel propulsion. Apparently unreliable diesels that only gave about half the expected performance. But then again, this was not a ship that needed to be fast. As a tender, Taigei would operate in safe harbors to support submarines, and that the ship did well enough, although there were evidently stability issues with a high freeboard and shallow draft. I can believe the former with the high hangar superstructure. Which brings us to the end of the design, and we can now talk about service again. This will be on the shorter end, as Taigei did relatively little in her original design, as could probably be expected when we're talking peacetime duty. First off, after the speedy construction, Taigei went in for fitting out. This would last until March 31st, 1934, which continued the general fast pace. A speedy fitting out to match a fast construction. Unfortunately for the tender, however, this would prove to be problematic in the long run, because after spending the rest of 1934 and early 1935 on training duty, well, she would be the victim of an infamous mishap. If you've been watching my Japanese videos, you're probably familiar with the 4th Fleet incident. In simplest terms, in September 1935, the 4th Fleet sailed for training. This was pretty routine. However, during this process, they pulled a Halsey, namely sailed into bad weather, eventually reaching typhoon status on September 26, 1935. This had both predictable and unpredictable results. Damage to the ships could be expected, as much stronger built ships suffered in Typhoon Cobra a decade later. The extent of the damage, however, was more of a surprise. Several ships were heavily damaged by this storm. Most importantly for this video, Taigei and a couple cruisers developed serious hull cracking. Their welded and lightly built hulls weren't quite up to the strain, and it showed. Taigei went in for repairs and refit at this point. This work would run from 1936 through 1937, primarily to strengthen the hull and add bulges to help with the stability issues mentioned earlier. By August of 1937, Taigei had come out of the refit. On August 19th, she was assigned to the 23rd Air Division. In this role, the ship carried the 23rd Sea Scout Unit and their floatplanes. Taigei would transport this group to South China, where half of it was transferred to the seaplane tender Kagu Maru. This was on September 15, 1937. The other half was transferred to another tender, Notaro, on September 2nd, at which point even combined fleet basically runs out of detailed notes on this ship's service. For the rest of 1937 through to 1941, it's just a list of commander changes, and the odd reassignment between bases and commands, which likely means the rest of the 1930s were primarily spent on training and support roles. In any event, this is coming up on where Taigei's story ends. By 1941, Japan considered her surplus as a submarine tender. The ship saw limited service in 1940, and by December of 1941, when the war began, well, she wasn't in service at all. As it turned out, Taigei was pulled from service on December 20th, 1941, for the conversion to a light carrier that she had been designed for. Even with this conversion baked into the design, it still took some time, until November of 1942, in fact. Because of this, the ship was in dock undergoing her conversion on April 18, 1942, where the ship was bombed during the Doolittle raid, taking one regular bomb hit. This was light damage, but it also makes her the only notable warship hit by the B-25s. The damage didn't really slow her conversion, however. Taigei would recommission into the Japanese Navy on November 30th, 1942. This is also where her name changed from Taigei to Ryuho. I'll briefly run down her capabilities as a light carrier before looking at her wartime career. The first and most notable change was the flush flight deck. The old superstructure was cut away, replaced by a hangar and flight deck, equipped with 2 elevators and capable of carrying around 30 aircraft. Later increased to 36 when the flight deck was lengthened in 1944. Not the largest air wing around, but perfectly functional. This flight deck, and other changes made to the hull, like side bulges and increased weaponry, raised the displacement from roughly 10,000 tons to around 15 to 16,000 at the full loading. Her speed would, however, not suffer from this. As a carrier, Ryuho could make around 26 knots. This came from a Kagero-class destroyer power plant rated at 52,000 shaft horsepower, still through 2 shafts, as that did not change during the rebuild. Similarly, no armor protection was added, at least that I can find. As for the weaponry, this now consisted of 8 12.7 centimeter guns in 4 twin mounts. These were carried in sponsons along the flight deck, 2 towards the bow and 2 towards the stern, supported in turn by the usual 25mm gun span, ranging from 38 to as high as 61 barrels, with the final loadout consisting of 10 triple, 4 twin, and 23 single mountings, along with some 13mm machine guns, and the same questionable depth charges and anti-aircraft rockets as the larger Unryu class, 6 depth charges and 6 28-cell rocket launchers. As that rounds off the design changes, let's return to wartime service, which was, as it turned out, mostly quiet. While Ryuho was a perfectly functional ship, she was also on the slower and lighter built side of things. The Japanese would, as a result, mostly hold her back from actual combat. Although, as it turned out, that lightly built hull was surprisingly sturdy. Shortly after returning to service, Ryuho would be dispatched on a ferry run to Truk. The carrier departed Japan on December 11th, 1942, and was promptly torpedoed by USS Drum about 160 miles east of Japan on December 12th. Details on exactly how bad this damage was vary between sources. Combined Fleet states it was one torpedo hit on the amidship starboard side, which did moderate damage and forced a return to port for repair work. The Dictionary of American Fighting Ships entry on Drum has a different story. It notes explosions, plural, and claims that Ryuho listed to starboard so badly that the entire flight deck was visible. That does not sound like moderate damage. Either way, Drum was forced to retreat before finishing the job, and Ryuho limped home for repairs. Repairs that would last until February 10th, 1943. Upon conclusion of that work, Ryuho would return to her ferry role. For early 1943, from March to June, she went on various ferry runs, mostly to the southern part of Japan's empire, where island bastions were suffering from American raids. This was an important mission, but not a glamorous one. It only changed on June 11th, when Ryuho picked up the air group of fellow conversion Hio. That ship was torpedoed, and while her repairs were underway, Ryuho operated her air group, for a certain value of operated. Ryuho's mission remained largely training duty, with a break on June 16th for another run to Truk. She would remain in that area until July 19th, 1943, at which point the ship returned to Japan, and by the end of August, Ryuho also lost Hio's air wing. On August 30th, this returned back to its home ship as she exited her repair work. For the rest of 1943, Ryuho would sail around Japan's empire, either on training missions or on a long patrol with Hio. This took the carrier as far afield as Singapore and Saipan before returning to Japan on January 2nd, 1944. A refit followed, lasting until the end of the month. And then, for early 1944, more training and ferry duty. You are probably picking up a pattern by this point. Ryuho would sail between Japan and various bases, including the Marianas, training pilots and delivering aircraft to those bases. The Marianas runs are particularly important because this was in preparation for the expected American attack, which would also see Ryuho's only combat mission. In May of 1944, she joined the Combined Fleet for the Battle of the Philippine Sea. This would take place on June 19th, where Ryuho sent her planes up with the rest of the Japanese attack. Unfortunately for those men, they were no more successful than the other Japanese pilots. Not through any fault on Ryuho's end in particular, but this battle is called the Marianas Turkey Shoot for very, very good reason. Ryuho's air wing was gutted, leaving the carrier to retreat without her aircraft, where she would be subjected to air attack on June 20th by planes off of USS Enterprise, 4 Avengers to be specific, which landed near misses. Ryuho's luck held out, in that those did very minimal damage. The same couldn't be said for other Japanese carriers, like her old partner Hio, crippled and sunk by the air attacks. This mostly marked the end of Ryuho's excitement. After arriving back in Japan in late June 1944, she spent most of her time around the home islands. First for a refit that began on July 11th. This is when the flight deck was extended nearly to the end of the bow. After exiting that refit on July 20th, she remained around Japanese waters. In fact, Ryuho didn't leave again until October 25th, 1944. meaning she wasn't part of the Northern Force for the Battle of Leyte Gulf. Instead, the ship was sent to Formosa, modern Taiwan, on a transport run. This would prove uneventful, with the carrier returning to Japan by November 2nd. Her next notable mission came on December 28, 1944, as part of another transport run to Formosa, this time carrying 58 Oka rocket bombs. Unlike the ill-fated Unryu, this would go well for Ryuho. She made her run with no damage, even during an air attack in harbor on January 9, 1945. Her gunners claimed one American aircraft shot down during this attack. However, after returning to Japan on January 18th, she never left the home islands again. That voyage to Formosa would turn out to be the last time any Japanese carrier left home waters during the war. Ryuho's luck would run out soon enough after this happened. On March 19, 1945, she was heavily damaged in an air attack on Kure. 3 direct bomb hits and 2 rocket hits buckled the flight deck. It also damaged the number 1 engine room and ripped open the hull on the port side. Fires broke out, and Ryuho suffered heavy flooding. 20 men were killed and 30 wounded. And yet, it wasn't crippling damage. Ryuho was patched up enough to sail to dry dock on April 1st. This got her stern cleared of water, but full repair work was deemed unnecessary. The Japanese couldn't operate the carriers they had, and Ryuho was of limited utility. So she was left in place in Kure. The ship would remain there until the end of the war, despite a further attack in July. While certainly damaged and not properly repaired, Ryuho did technically remain afloat and theoretically operational. So, on that metric, she survived the war, only to be scrapped in 1946. Her career was far from exciting, but I think Ryuho is an interesting case. An underwhelming tender converted into an underwhelming carrier, but one that survived a torpedo hit and then bombing to live out the war entirely. For all her weak construction, this ship proved quite tough in the end. Thank you for watching. Remember to like, comment, and subscribe if you enjoy the content, and I'll see you in the next one.